Good evening. And well, it's not quite Rosh Chodesh here yet, but it's just about Rosh Chodesh Adar here. And anybody who's a bit east of me is Rosh Chodesh Adar for you already. So a good Chodesh for you. We're now heading into one of the more famous Gemaras around. Tana Rabbanan. We learned in a Brisa. La'olam yehe adam in vasan ki Hillel. A person should always be humble like Hillel, va'al yehe kaptan, and he should not be someone who is strict, ki Shammai, like Shammai. Let's pause over there for a moment. So Rav Kook focuses over here on the use of the word la'olam, always. And he explains that both being very humble and forgiving like Hillel is a trait that has its place, and sometimes being very strict, as Shammai tended to be, also has its place. Neither one of these midos is always right, and neither one of these midos, neither one of these character traits is always wrong. But he says that over here, the Gemara is focused on la'olam, forever, always, meaning what is the primary trait that a person should take as his trait? And in that, the Gemara is explaining that your primary trait, that has got to be an unav, to somebody with humbleness and humility. Sometimes maybe you have to be strict, as Shammai was. But that's not the la'olam trait. That's not the trait that you should always be focused on demonstrating. Rav Moshe David Valley explains that, well, first of all, we just step back for a moment, and I'm sure many of you are familiar. Kabbalistically, we understand that Hillel was representing chesed, kindness, always giving, whereas Shammai represents gvura, that's power, that's strength, limitation. And so Rav Moshe David Valley is bothered by a question, because he says that people naturally have an affinity to one or the other. So how can the Gemara over here make a blanket statement that everybody has to be like Hillel and not like Shammai? It's not so simple, because some people are naturally the humble, easygoing sorts of people, and other people are naturally strict, tough people. So how is the Gemara going ahead over here and making one blanket rule for everybody? And so Rav Moshe David Valley explains that even if you are a person like me, who is perhaps naturally drawn to the side of gvura, it doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to change your behavior and to control yourself. Everybody has the ability, to one extent or another, to change his behavior from his natural tendencies. And whether it involves doing certain mitzvos that turn the person towards more of a chesed than gvura, or in other ways, but a person is not destined by his natural affinities. His life is not determined by them, and everybody has the ability to engage in some sort of behavioral change. He explains that the reason why Hashem established this famous clash between Hillel and Shammai, again, Hillel representing Chesed and Shammai representing Gvura, is this was meant to be an antidote to the antics of Korach. Because Korach, representing Gvura, went up against Moshe Rabbeinu, who represented Chesed. But in the case of Korach, which the Mishnah in Perek Avos famously says was a machlokes that was not l'shem shamayim, Korach was not just simply trying to represent a particular viewpoint, but rather he had his own vested interest in establishing and supporting a certain particular viewpoint that was not l'shem shamayim. It was not for altruistic reasons, his machlokas with Moshe, and therefore the machlokas didn't last, and Korach and his family went down. But Hashem saw to it that in the future there would be machlokas between Hillel and Shammai, each one of them representing the same poles, but doing it for altruistic reasons and not for selfish reasons. And therefore you had a machlokas that was sofo lehiskayim, a disagreement that lasted for all time. And because of the fact that this disagreement was l'shem shamayim and not for personal reasons, that's why despite the fact that in many areas of halacha, the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel differed, but that was only in terms of halachic matters. But in personal matters, the Gemara tells us it was always peace between them. They married each other, and there was no rift between them, despite the fact that it was two different schools of thought. So Maisa, the Gemara goes on, there was a story, B'shnei b'nei Adam, about two people. Shehimru zeh im zeh. They made a bet with each other. Amru, they said, Kol mi sheyelech, either one of us who succeeds in going, v'yaknit is Hillel, and angers Hillel, Yitol should take tough zuz, 400 zuz. And Amr Echad Mehem, one of them said, Ani aknitenu, I am going to go and anger Hillel. Now, as Rav Kook, we're going to rely a lot on Rav Kook for our explanation of this particular Gemara. As Rav Kook points out, every single last thing that this person did throughout the rest of the story was all geared to be as disrespectful and obnoxious as possible. Osu Hayom Erev Shabbos Haya. That day was Erev Shabbos, it was Friday. The Hillel Chofef es Rosho. And Hillel was in the middle of washing his hair. Holach, the man, went, v'avar al Pesach Beso, and he walked past the doorway of Hillel's home. And Amar, he started shouting, Mi kan Hillel, Mi kan Hillel, who's Hillel, who's Hillel, where is he? Now, one can presume, Rav Kook says, that Hillel, being the Nasi, the leader of the Jewish people knew where his house was. And even if you had some emergency on Friday afternoon when Hillel's in the middle of taking a shower, you could just go and knock on his door like a civilized human being. But he didn't do that. He walked right past Hillel's doorway, starts shouting, where is this guy Hillel, basically, speaking in a disrespectful manner, rather than approaching directly to Hillel. And he went on. Nisatef v'yatza l'kraso. Hillel got himself dressed and went out to greet this person who was there to anger him. Amrlo, and Hillel said to him, Bini, my son, ma'ata mevakesh, what are you seeking? Amrlo, he said, She'ela yesh li lishol, I've got a question to ask. Amarle and Hillel responded, Sha'al b'ni, Sha'al, ask my son, ask. So as Rav Kook points out, you see over here in this Gemara the true anivus, the true humility of Hillel HaZaken. He says somebody who is truly humble is because he is living his life in the truth, in the reality, without any imagination, no thoughts of grandeur, at the same time, no self-deprecating thoughts. And therefore, the first thing as far as Hillel was concerned was, despite the fact that this man was, again, addressing him in the most disrespectful manner, is you don't come to greet a person unless you're dressed properly. Hillel didn't show up at the door, wrapped in a towel. He got himself properly dressed. Why? Because I have self-respect. Being humble doesn't mean you lack self-respect. Keep in mind that in the Christian translations of the Bible, humility is mistakenly translated as meekness. Now, it's possible that back in the good old days, meek and humble were synonyms, but a person who's humble is not meek. A person who's humble is straight. And the first thing Hillel did was, someone wants to speak to me? And if I have to speak to another person, I'm going to treat him with respect. And the first way to treat somebody with respect is to show up yourself in a respectful manner. Keep in mind that the more respectful you are, the more respect a person will feel when you show them respect. And therefore, the first thing Hillel does is to make sure to get dressed properly, come to his door as a respectful manner and as a respectful person. Then he goes on. Mipnei ma rasheim shel bavliim segalgalos. Why is it that the heads of the Babylonians, now in Rashi, there seems to be a question what the word segalgalos means. Either it means that they were very round, their heads, or their heads weren't round whatsoever. Either way, he's coming to Hillel on a Friday afternoon asking some seemingly ludicrous question about the shape of the heads of Babylonians. Amar le, so Hillel responded, B'ni, my son, she'ela gedola sha'alta, you've asked a very good question. And he answered him, she'ein lahem chayos pikos. It's because their midwives are not particularly smart. And therefore, when the Babylonians are born, the midwives don't know how to handle their heads properly, and their heads come out a bit misshapen. The Ian Yaakov points out, the Yisio Hillel says, She'ela gedola sha'alta, you've asked a great question. He says, because when a person comes and asks you a question, even if the question appears to be a ridiculous question, don't just push them away and ridicule them, but rather you should respond to them as if they've asked something very great and very important. Because otherwise, even if now they ask something foolish, if you don't treat them with respect, then later on they might have a serious and important question to ask, and they'll be afraid to, because they'll say, oh, last time I asked a question, I was ridiculed. And if I try to ask another question now, I'm going to be ridiculed again. No more questions for me. Once again, this shir today was sponsored in memory of Chana Devora Bas Avram. We welcome any other inquiries. If someone would like to sponsor, please contact me on Facebook or by my email at cslando@gmail.com. Have a great evening.